Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As we've heard a bunch today, the role of data in the criminal justice system has evolved a lot in the last decade. People tend to trust data-driven systems. They remove supposedly some of the human errors that have, laid waste to the best parts of the criminal justice system. How are you seeing folks balance the desire to combat, this injustice in the system with the growing skepticism of big data as it's applied to criminal justice?
So, I think, fundamentally, one of the problems with this kind of drive towards data-driven and kind of algorithmic decision-making is, the concern that the data that people are relying on is infected with this country's history of racism and inequality. Essentially what you're doing is replicating that terrible history by using data that is essentially garbage and kind of putting it through a machine and getting garbage out and getting garbage predictions. And so I think that's the kind of fundamental problem. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of that problem as there's been more of an effort to rely on these types of tools to try and help and improve criminal justice decision making. I think that part of it, kind of the acknowledgement and understanding, is a really good thing and a positive development. But I remain kind of incredibly skeptical about the usefulness of using these approaches.
Logan, what are some of the misconceptions as you're looking at, data being heralded as one of these really positive things for the criminal justice system? What are some misconceptions about the way that it's actually applied?
So I think one helpful thing is I think frequently we think that data is objective and it represents the sort of like natural existence of something occurring in the world. But of course, when we're talking about the criminal justice system, criminologists have long studied this and said that really this underlying data is representative of enforcement patterns. It's not necessarily representative of quote unquote underlying crime data and the actual commission of crime. And we have to remember that this is representative of how police officers are responding to things in their community. And I think that's a fundamental disconnect, because I frequently am talking with different individuals who are saying, hey, if I want to adopt something like a pretrial risk assessment tool or a predictive policing system, this is just sort of objective data that's arrest level data. But of course, we know that different things are arrested at different patterns for different groups. For example, we know that domestic violence is often not reported. And so if you're going to build a model that was going to forecast where domestic violence crimes might be committed or forecast, you'd have statistically unreliable data simply because that's not reported. And you can go into various different reasons why that might not be reported, for fear of the police, fear of reporting, many different things. But I think there's just this myth that this crime data is inherently objective in some way.
Can that be overcome?
I think it can be.
Big question.
I don't know if it can necessarily be overcome, because in some sense, all police departments will inherently be constrained, right? There are going to be some number of units of officers who can only respond to some number of things, right? I think one thing to think about is potentially there are maybe some crimes that don't show sort of underlying disparities in arrest level data that communities maybe truly are shown to truly care about, where they're struggling with maybe saying domestic violence or aggravated assault, things like that. But I don't think I see many strategies that are improving that today.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it can be overcome. I don't think that it can, actually. I think we can confront it. I think we may be able to account for it. I'm not kind of a data scientist or a technologist in that way, but I think there may be ways to try and account for some measure of where kind of the racism or the bias is kind of influencing the data. But I think fundamentally, there's so much inequality and so much racial bias woven into the DNA of this country that kind of whatever system you tie it back to, there's going to have some racial impact, right? And so kind of whether you're looking at housing, education, employment, age of first arrest, where police are deployed, all those things are tied into race. And so I think in order to kind of scrub the data, so to speak, of the racism, I think is an incredibly difficult, if not impossible task, at least from my view.
So how do we account for it?
Well, my thing is we just stop using these tools. We kind of go in a different direction. And fundamentally right now, all the tools are being pointed at the people who are being consumed by these systems. I would like to see tools that are aimed at police officers, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, to determine, if we have a concern about trying to change the system itself and the behavior of actors within the system, why don't we try to change the behaviors of those who are kind of replicating some of the biases we see already? Why are we trying to predict what people might do? The reality is, as a public defender, there are some people who I knew would come back to court. Some people I thought would definitely come back to court without any problem. Some people I thought would never show up again. And I was surprised regularly about what would happen. The human condition is really difficult to predict. And I think the idea that we'll be able to predict it better with machines fundamentally misunderstands how people work.
I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, on that point, I think something that's been interesting is sort of when we think about sort of big data or algorithms, a lot of this is focused on prediction generally, and of course there's sort of prediction is ubiquitous throughout the criminal justice system, and individuals will be predicting things on their own. But I think hopefully many people did not need this reminder. But as new tools have been developed, you have sort of rote, more actuarial based regression statistics tools, and then you have more sort of machine learning based tools. I think as you sort of try and refine this along the path, what you're really doing, there's a great new paper by Sandy Mason that'll be published in the Yale Law Journal that basically says what we're doing is really just sort of putting up a mirror that is just more and more accurate, and the solution isn't to bend the mirror to your liking, so it's not to account for like, okay, how can we adjust the model? Like, what matters is what you're seeing in the mirror, right? And that is the underlying thing that you should really be trying to adjust for.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets to the fundamental point that what we need to do is have kind of a paradigm shift about the way we do criminal justice, not kind of like tinkering around the edges and making a bad system work a little bit more efficiently. I think that's what these tools often purport to do.
Yeah, it sounds like both of you have brought up that basically these technologies are just kind of preserving the same system under the guise of scientific objectivity. Talk about how that perceived objectivity is kind of stifles progress.
Well, I think in many ways there's this sense that if you're kind of relying on a tool and a tool tells you that this individual may or may not do this particular thing, you're never going to kind of do any kind of deeper inquiry into what the kind of the human condition is about. And so you're never going to find out. Like, so for example, I think when you think about a risk assessment tool that's designed to figure out if someone's going to kind of appear in court or not, the type of data they're usually looking at are kind of age of first arrest, prior warrant history, the things that they may think correlate with failure to appear. But there are other data points that are never kind of examined. You may not return to court because you just don't have the resources to get back to court. You may not return to court because you have a terrible experience with court before and you're worried about what's going to happen. You may not return to court because you have family circumstances or other things that may have interfered with your ability to get back to court. A data point that's not kind of considered at all is never going to be measured and never going to be part of kind of your range of considerations. And so I think that's problematic in and of itself.
Yeah, Logan, we were talking a little bit backstage about kind of the slow-moving policy reform, how quickly and rapidly technology changes, and how the dissonance between those timelines makes it really difficult for policy to catch up. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think one sort of interesting paradox is sort of, if you look at sort of the current movement of bail reform as it's conceptualized with certain policymakers, I think there's a sort of unanimous understanding that the money bail system needs to go away. And a lot of policymakers are looking towards risk assessment tools to sort of reform away an unjust system. And along the way, they're adopting good policies. So money bail, that means, if you are a person who can't pay $500 to get out of jail, there are plenty of studies that show that your risk of rearrest will be increased because in the 72 hours you've been detained, your life might have fallen apart. You could lose your job, lose custody of your children, things like that. There are other important policies like text reminders can reduce failure to appear a lot. But the problem is when we implement these new technologies, they're inherently looking to the past. So if you're looking to something that doesn't incorporate the actual new beneficial policies, you're just going to be forecasting the likelihood of someone's risk based on the previous system. So it's really hard to generate these positive feedback loops because frequently these counties and cities don't have the budget to do quote unquote data science properly. And it's a really hard task to get right. And I think that's an underappreciated element in the current debate.
So how do we, cast our lenses forward? what are the challenges in trying to do something that's forward-looking instead of something that uses kind of historical data that doesn't work?
So one thing that's interesting is there's a great paper that's sort of trying to reframe this entire debate. It's called Interventions Over Predictions. And really what it's postulating is instead of looking at this sort of risk assessment stuff that's trying to look at historical data to project things forward, it's saying, let's look at something called causal inference methods. So that's basically trying to do new statistical techniques where you're trying to say what interventions really actually work. So by doing that, you're creating new data that can actually say, okay, this actual new change helped someone get back to court. This new change helped this class of defendants never get touched by the criminal justice system again. And I think that's one thing that's sort of more forward-looking.
Yeah, and to me, that sounds a little bit kind of like more of a needs assessment intervention than anything else. And so, like, you know, when you think about predictive policing and the notion that it's going to predict where a crime might take place or who might be involved in crime, rather than send, if you think a neighborhood is going to be the site of some criminal activity, why are we sending police officers into that neighborhood? Why don't we figure out, like, okay, that neighborhood needs more schools, that neighborhood needs more jobs, that neighborhood needs more social workers. You know, to me, I'm always struck by the fact that our response to some of these inequities is a criminal justice response, rather than a kind of a social justice response, rather than a response that actually lifts up people and helps them avoid the path of criminality. And so you know, part of what I would like to see is that type of methodology instilled as well.
Absolutely. Before I take it to the audience for a question, I wanted to ask one bigger, broader question. We talked about pretrial risk tools and predictive policing, and we're often using these big terms like risk and danger, and they're often ill-defined and subjectively applied. How does that complicate the use of data? Obviously, it sounds like you both think that neither of those tools are a step in the right direction, but how does one even begin to calculate a tolerable amount of risk in a community or a tolerable amount of danger?
I would just note that when we think about bail, it wasn't legal necessarily for judges to predict future dangerousness until about 1987 when the Supreme Court codified it. So this is a new sort of legal regime that we've established. So there's nothing necessarily, I mean, we can have a spirited debate about the underlying sort of court's decisions leading to the predictions of future dangerousness. But I just sort of question how, I mean, from one perspective, we have sort of rearrest data standing in for the proposition of sort of public safety. But so many things that people are rearrested for say nothing about violence to a community or public safety at all. And I just color me skeptical that any risk assessment tools as sort of currently proposed and implemented will sort of succeed in their aims.
And you know, I'll just say very quickly, I think fundamentally risk is part of life. You know, I think you can't, we could walk outside and get hit by a bus, you know, but you don't stop crossing the street because of that. Like that's part, like risk is what the criminal justice system has to accept as part of the cost of doing business. And so I think the notion we'll be able to predict who's riskier, who's not, to me it just doesn't kind of really make any sense.
Do we have a question in the audience? I think we have one down here in the front.
Hi, it's me again, Vivian Nixon. So I want to ask, what roles do you think using science that actually would help, like science about sentencing reform and decriminalization, could do to eliminate some of the problems we're facing?
So I mean, I think there is, like, to the extent you're looking at data and thinking about science, I think to the extent you're holding up kind of good results from things like decriminalization, from things like de-incarcerating places, from things like releasing people early from sentences, from diverting people from the criminal justice system, I think that data, for some reason, is never kind of the stuff that people cite or think about when thinking about kind of evidence-based practices, right? And so I think those are all data points that would be very helpful in informing kind of decision-making about the way in which we should kind of shape our criminal justice policy more generally. So I'm all for using data in that way. I think, to me, it's just problematic when you're deciding how long you're going to sentence somebody for, or if you're going to release them on parole. Even in the bail context, I mean, I think there's a place to say, here's an entire class of people, and by the way, the vast majority of people who are released from pretrial incarceration return to court. So it's not as though we have people kind of just skipping court willy-nilly all the time. But here's an entire population of folks or a cohort of folks who can be released without ever even going through the court system at all. And so I think there are probably ways you can use it in a positive way. But unfortunately, those don't seem to be the ones that are kind of advanced that often.
So we have one more question in the back.
Hi, how y'all doing? So really quickly, thank you, number one. I just read this book by James Foreman Jr. called Locking Up Our Own, which was amazing if you guys haven't read it. But he really just talks about how these innate community barriers that should be more of a human services issue have been criminalized. So when you deal with things like addiction, we've turned addiction into a criminalization. So when you have someone who commits crimes as a result of their addiction, we want to lock them up instead of sending them back to rehab. And his whole statement was, why don't we view rehab the same way that we view the prison system? Like, the first time you try to quit smoking, you're probably not going to get it. So why don't we send them back there as opposed to putting them into prison because they didn't kick the habit the first time? So my question is, in what way, if possible, do you think that we can it could possibly incorporate these community conditions and these restorative types of practices so that everyone who suffers from, everyone who's not just a hardened criminal isn't caught up in that whirlpool, if you will?
I think one interesting idea to kind of combine both questions is, I think you could reconceptualize risk assessments to include another factor. So, for example, the risk of any pretrial detention greater than 24 hours to that person. What impact would that have on their life? We know of all these sort of negative outcomes. Actually sort of formalizing that for the process could really, I think, recalibrate and get us closer to that model of course, when we're thinking of addiction, your first time trying to struggle through that, it's not necessarily going to sort of latch your first time. You have to try and try and try. I think sort of maybe potentially having this sort of, if we were to put this person inside the system, how would that impact them in a negative way? I think that might be one potential solution. Yeah.
Vincent, Logan, thank you so much.
Thank you.